now we will begin today's question and answer portion of the talk. As today's host said in the introduction, we will conduct the Q&A with the slips of paper that you were handed when you came in. So please write your question on the paper and hand it to one of our volunteers, and they'll bring it up to me. So, Kasper, it was a very informative talk. Let's talk a little bit first about, you told us how you came to Korea. Is it common for a non-native English speaker to find work as an English speaker here in Korea?
No, not really. It is very, like most schools, hard ones, they want native speakers. Well, basically, the only reason I got the job was because I had a friend who worked at a particular hard one. So I do know a couple of other adoptees who work as English teachers, but it is a minority. Like the vast majority is, American or English or whatever. And me being here as a teacher is basically a very lucky, it's basically luck in a way.
Okay, and a little bit more about your own personal history. You mentioned you have a master's degree in history and Russian. So are we to assume that you speak Russian as well as Danish and English? And what is your Korean language ability?
Well, I can say that my Russian is better than my Korean at any rate, but it's also pretty rusty. I studied Russian as a minor at my university in Denmark for about 2 years, I think. And I was also an exchange student, not an exchange student, I was a language student at university in St. Petersburg for about 3 months. That's also, by the way, where I first met Koreans. So you could say I came to Korea via Russia. Because, that's the first time I actually saw Koreans, actual, Koreans, and discovered that they weren't, fairy tale creatures, actual people, and made me curious to learn more. My language, my Korean language level is low, very low. I have been taking a language class at the GIC, and I also had language class when I was an exchange student at Songyongwan. But it is a very difficult language. It's, as I said, it's like, culture-wise, Korea is almost opposite of Denmark, and language-wise, it's same. It's like Danish is here, like Korea is way over here. So it is it's very low. And hopefully, I hope I can improve, but I also know it's going to be a very long process.
So you mentioned first meeting Koreans almost for the first time in Russia. So is there not much of a non-adoptee Korean-Danish community? And what is there, you mentioned several times being mistaken for Chinese. What is the overall Asian community like in Denmark?
Sorry, what's the first part of the question?
Sorry, two-part question. Part one, is there much of a non-adoptee Korean community in Denmark? And okay. What is the part two? What is the general Asian community like in Denmark?
Well, speaking of the Korean part, not really. As I said, I wrote back in last year, I wrote an article for the GIC newsletter about adoption in Denmark and Koreans in Denmark. And you could say that basically the Korean community in Denmark is adoptees. As you said, it's 9,000. And that's like I think I remember reading that there was a certain point in Denmark in the 80s that if you met an Asian person, chances were that he or she was probably from Korea. I know nowadays there is, I've heard there is like more immigration, like more Korean immigration from Korea to Denmark, because people are attracted to the welfare state, the Danish welfare state, and the very socialized system we have. But it is very tiny. I mean, like there is like exchange students. I've met plenty of, I've met like Korean exchange students in Denmark, but most of them go home after they finish their studies. So very small, much smaller than the Korean adoptee community. And also with Asians, as I said, growing up, if you saw an Asian person, like in the 80s, he was probably adopted. That's changed, since I think like the 90s. You see more and more Chinese students, professionals, immigrants. All of this. Also, I don't know if you also Southeast Asian, like Thai, Vietnamese. For some reason, I'm usually not mistaken for being one of those. People usually mistake me for being, well, yeah, as I said, in the past, when I was a child, people would often mistake me for being Inuit, and nowadays people sometimes mistake me for being Chinese. So I guess that's an improvement in some ways.
So you stressed several times that you're talking today about your own personal experience. However, in your discussions with other Danish-Korean adoptees, is there some similarities that adoptees share within the community? Is there a common thread?
Yes. Like at least among those like adoptees I speak to, and you can also, well, yes, the feeling of being different, the feeling of not quite fitting in either in their career or their home country is something that runs strong. Like it's something that a lot of people experience. Not all people. There are Korean adoptees who have who don't think of themselves as Korean at all, who basically think of themselves as Danish or American first and only. And the fact that they are from Korea has no real meaning for them. But among, let's say, the organized Korean adoptee community, yes, there's like, this is basically, let's say, 101 stuff that most people are dealing with, issues of identity, of self-worth, of being a minority or whatever. Like I said, I speak for myself, but my thoughts and experiences are by no means like uncommon.
You mentioned something about American Korean adoptees having things like Korean camp. Do you think that adoptive parents in Denmark should likewise attempt to instill a sense of Korean identity in their adoptive children? Do you think that's a good path to go down?
I would have to say first off that I don't really actually know what goes on in Korea camp, so I don't know if that's actually a good thing or not. It's just like, it was just something compared to nothing in Denmark, and I guess something is always better than nothing. There is, in Denmark, I should also say, there is like, when I was adopted, people didn't really, let's say, think about this stuff, or it wasn't really a part of the discussion about adoption at the time, about, children fitting in, about, or wanting to, go back to their roots, or trying to discover their home countries or home cultures. There is more awareness about that today. There is like, it's part of, I think, like the basic information that, adoptee parents have to be informed of. And there's also, I think, like certain programs to try to give the children more awareness of their home cultures and stuff. But I can't really speak about it in detail. I don't know what it actually consists of. But yeah, speaking personally, I mean, yes, as I said, something is always better than nothing. Korea, as I said, it might as well have been on the moon when I grew up. And all of these issues that I've been dealing with, nobody really told me about that. It just sort of like something that just came by itself, and then I had to deal with it on my own. And it's difficult to deal with it on your own. In some ways, the only way I really was able to deal with it was through others, joining the wider community and talking with other adoptees about it. So, yes, they should do more.
Okay.
They can always do more.
We just have time for a few more questions, and our penultimate question here will be one that several people asked. Several people want to know, why Russian for the major? It's very random. It was basically because I wanted to learn a foreign language. Basically at high school, I wasn't the best student. And I was very lazy when it came to studying language. Not English, but English is also easy. But I wanted to learn
a foreign language. And my university offered Russian as a sort of introductory course. And we could also go to St. Petersburg, so that was also a big part of it, traveling, seeing other countries. Maybe not the most job-relevant subject afterwards, but Russia is an interesting country. And it's an interesting language. They make beautiful poetry. So I guess I didn't know about it before when I chose it, but I'm fairly satisfied with my choice, even if it was kind of random.
Okay, well, now it's time for our last question. So I'm throwing questions on the floor. Your talk was very interesting and generated a lot of questions. So I'm sorry we didn't have time to cover everyone's question, but if you didn't have your question answered, please feel to approach Kasper, today's speaker, after the talk and ask your question directly. So for the final question, I don't pretend to speak Danish, but someone in the audience knows at least one Danish word, hygge. The cozy feeling is an important feature of Danish culture. Do you feel that there's a similar element within Korean culture, and in general, what are some of the similarities that you found between Danish culture and Korean culture?
Well, with the first part, I can't really say because I don't know enough Korean. If there's like some equivalent to that word. As for the second part, well, yes, there is some similarities. In general, well, you can say that both Korea and Denmark are kind of small countries that want to make themselves more known on a wider stage. I also know that Korean history is very let's say tormented. There's been a lot of wars and invasions. And Danish history is kind of similar. Like we've lost I think every war like the last 200 years. At one point the country was much bigger. Like it had Norway and some islands in the Mediterranean or something. So it's also had its share of, let's say, loss and national humiliation. And there's a certain inward focus among the cultures. Though the way they express that is different. And you could say, I would say that probably Denmark is probably more at peace with its own history of defeat and humiliation than Korea is. It seems to be a much more raw subject in Korea than in Denmark. Like people are basically, we lost to the Germans and the Swedes and the English and everybody else. But, yeah, that's okay.
Okay, well, thank you for taking the time to answer our questions. Let's give him another round of applause.